So yeah, let's begin. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Rabbi israh li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this seminar today. And of course, it is indeed a great pleasure to virtually come back to the university, to my alma mater in Oxford, to present this fascinating topic that I myself find very much interesting, which is what Indonesia's engagement with the Palestinian question tells us about Muslim-Christian relations in the archipelago. My name is Gilang Ghifari Lukman. You can call me Gilang. And as Martin introduced, I just graduated from my master's program here in Oxford. I did an MPhil in Modern Middle Eastern Studies with specific interest on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and affairs, and specifically its relations with my home country, Indonesia. So yeah, that's my background. This is pretty much what I do. I'm also currently the head of Research Bureau and at Haifa Institute, an Indonesia-based educational and media platform for Israeli-Palestinian affairs. So this is pretty much, apart from my academic interest, my activism and my outside of work, so to speak, activities. So hopefully I have several insights that I could share with you all today. A table of contents of what I would like to present today within the boundary of our time limitation, for sure. I would like to give you a bit of a general overview of the issue, why I find this topic interesting and why I did a research about it. I will then proceed with an analysis and exploration about Indonesian Muslims' engagement with the Palestinian question, with the Palestinian people, and why Palestine, and especially Al-Aqsa, the third holiest mosque in the religion of Islam, is so important for these Muslims. I would proceed by going to another group, namely Indonesian Christians, which comprise the biggest religious group for a minority population in Indonesia, and its perspective and their perspectives towards the state of Israel. And then after knowing the perspective of each community towards the respective quote unquote side in the conflict, we would like to see how does that instructs our instructs our understanding about Muslim and Christian relations in the archipelago of Indonesia. Then we will end with some Q&A and discussion session, time permitting. Before I start, I would like to begin with some personal stories because we love anecdotes, don't we? Right? So in 2019, I went to South Korea to attend an academic conference in Korea University in the capital city of Seoul. And it so happened that when I went out from the university after finishing the presentation, there was quite a big street protest happening in the city. The target of the protest was the current Korean president, which is perceived to be too lenient towards North Korea, and is perceived to be kind of like undermining the traditional alliance between the country and the US. Now, interestingly, as you could see, this is the picture that I took with my own phone. There is one Israeli flag, but there are actually a lot of Israeli flags being raised in the protest. Despite the fact that this is, I would say, an inherently and explicitly domestic affairs street protest, but then suddenly I have this question, like what on earth does a flag of a foreign country that has no relations whatsoever with Korean domestic affairs being raised? Then I noticed that this is not a peculiar incident, but a recurring one. So much so that there is actually has been a dedicated study on this phenomenon, written by Saracho and Juhen Lee. The title is Waving Israeli Flags at Right-Wing Christian Rallies in South Korea. So if you go to right-wing Christian rallies in South Korea, you would easy to see Israeli flags typically being paraded with alongside South Korean and American flags. And you could read the journal. It's very interesting. But basically, Israeli flags there is understood as being representative of the Israel as it is understood in the Christian religion. So it's not so much about the state, the modern state of Israel, but it's really representative of the Christian attachment, mainly to the Old Testament. Then fast forward 2 years later, in 2021, in Oxford, actually, when I attended a Palestinian Solidarity rally in the city, I find alongside the dozens of Palestinian flags being raised there, this particular flag. And this is not the flag of Cuba, as many of us would have probably guessed. This is actually, this is called the Bendera Bintang Kejora, or the Morning Star flag of the Free Papua movement. And what is this Free Papua movement? So this Free Papua movement is basically a separatist group that is based in the island of Papua. This is the easternmost region of the Republic of Indonesia, which has a long-standing, let's say, historical, unsolved historical affairs within the broader history of the Indonesian Republic, and mainly because of the somewhat forced incorporation of the region to the Republic around the 60s. But basically, there are remaining people and movements within the island that still demand independence from the region. Now, understandably, this flag is being raised inside a Palestinian Solidarity rally because for some within the movement, Papua is like Indonesia's Palestine, right? Indonesia being projected as this similar to the Israeli state, powerful, with a strong military and security apparatus, oppressing, let's say, so to speak, the weak Papuans, which is similar as what we see in Israel, Palestine, the strong Israeli state partaking in several numerous, if not numerous, oppressive actions against the Palestinians. So it's very much understandable why this flag would be raised in that context. But interestingly, if you actually go in the island of Papua yourself, yeah, so because this, of course, in Oxford, thousands of miles away from their home country in Indonesia and Papua. But if you go there in Papua, you would actually find the opposite. You don't find Palestinian flags being popularly used or displayed in the public, but you would actually find more Israeli flags, especially in Christian establishments. So Papua is Christian majority province. You would actually find Israeli and Jewish symbols being paraded and popularly used, much more so than the Palestinian flag, which of course is, for me, is very perplexing, right? You would imagine them using the Palestinian flag because it more accurately represents their situation of oppression, but then this is what you will see empirically on the ground. So these two anecdotes really instills interest, as it is a sense of perplextions and just simply being puzzled of the situation of why is this the case. Because I as a student in the Modern Middle Eastern Studies department, we mainly discuss the Palestinian question and its relation with Israel, mainly in its material aspects, such as what is happening, what is the kind of territorial dispute that is happening, the reality of dispossession, the refugee crisis, the different wars that took place, several wars that took place in the region in the past decades. But we don't really find often an emphasis on the immaterial aspects of the conflict, how the conflict has also been understood not so much as a concrete or material reality of violence, of dispossession, but also in its symbolic and emblemic form, as symbols of aspiration, as signifiers of good on virtue, as signifiers of piety, of religious belonging, and so forth. So that's really what drove me to partake in this ambitious project, namely my master's thesis. So I entitled it Indonesia and the Question of Palestine, Navigating Religious and Third World Discurrents. The work is quite extensive, it's quite long. And so for the purpose of today, I would only limit on one chapter, which I called A Cosmic Turn. So even though my thesis covers the issue comprehensively on the material aspects for sure, like what kind of foreign aid that Indonesia gives to Palestine, for instance, or the diplomatic dynamics between the two nations. But for the purpose of today, I would like to focus more, perhaps the more interesting part, which is the symbolic and emblemic aspect of the conflict that is being internalized, interestingly, inside Indonesia's domestic affairs, and particularly, of course, this is a webinar of Christian-Muslim relations, for us to understand Christian-Muslim relations, especially in Southeast Asian context. Some notes on scope and methodology, because we academics love caveats, right? This is only, what I'm going to discuss today is only a chapter from the entire thesis. So I think for us to really understand the context and the link between different issues, I would really suggest that the audience read the entirety of the thesis that I would, of course, happily share after this. Methodology-wise, it's a qualitative work which derive its data from via a triangulation of sources, namely in-depth interviews with Indonesians, Palestinians, and Israelis. Most of them choose not to be anonymous, so over the course of the presentation, I would actually attribute the quotes to respective persons. These are, some of them are very prominent individuals, chairman of the parliament, or general secretary of political parties, and so forth. So it's quite ambitious project indeed. It also includes archival works, mainly from the Israeli State Archives and National Library. And especially for this chapter on Muslim-Christian relations, I also derive mainly from critical media research, because really what is happening and most of the information and the interesting analysis comes from our engagement with how this issue is talked about in social media and magazines and newspaper. Again, a bit of caveats. This chapter is really focused more on empirical and analytical discussion and not so much theoretical. So maybe yay for us, less text, more pictures, and more interesting stuffs. And of course, I can only identify some general patterns from the Muslim and Christian communities in Indonesia, while of course we have to be aware of the sheer diversity of the denominations. Different groups put different emphasis on the issue, but yeah, due to the time limitation, we could not dig the rabbit hole, so we would only identify the general patterns. All right, so with that in mind, I think it's only fair that I need to give the audience a primer, a bit of a primer about Indonesia's socio-cultural, historical, and political context. I think for many people in the country, Southeast Asian region, let alone Indonesia, is the part of the world where it is rarely spoken of with greater depth. So this is, I think it's only fair that I have to familiarize the audience with the region. So Indonesia, right, is located between the Asian continent and Australia. Is very, very big. It's actually perhaps as wide as the European continent, to put it into perspective. It is a Muslim majority country, and as many and most, if not all, Muslim majority countries in the world, pro-Palestinian voice is very strong. However, this country is located outside of the Arab world, and it is among the few Muslim majority countries that have a solid democratic system in place. So I would argue we would still provide fresh insights to the issue as compared to, let's say, studying about Palestinian question from the perspective of Egypt, for instance, or Turkey. Indonesia have very interesting stuff to offer. Also because we have in Indonesia a significant non-Muslim population, approximately 35 million people. That's approximately equal, if not more than the combination of the Dutch, Belgian, and Swiss population combined. So that's a lot of non-Muslims. Most of them are Christians. So even though I put it into perspective, it's still a minority in Indonesia. It's still a big voice, a big number that we have to look at. Third of all, I have to stress from the beginning that the Indonesian government policy that is staunchly pro-Palestinian is mainly based from its anti-colonial discourse, and I will explain why. But basically, unlike countries such as Malaysia or Pakistan, or let's say Tunisia, where their politicians are much more comfortable to include religious narrative to justify the support for Palestinians. In Indonesia, traditionally speaking, it has been largely a taboo. You have to typically, if you go to the foreign ministry, they would exclusively rely on anti-colonial discourse, rarely, if ever, using a religious or Islamic narrative. So yeah, so having these three important points in mind, I will proceed. This is just a matrix that helps me to really justify to the readers of my thesis why Indonesia has a very interesting, is an interesting position to offer fresh insights, because as you could see, it has very unique circumstances, right? It is a non-Arab nation. It has democratic system in place. It has substantial non-Muslim population. Islam is not a state of religion, right? Unlike the Muslim majority countries above. So there are like at least 5 aspects that belongs to Indonesia that is just not there in other Muslim majority countries, such as, let's say, Malaysia, for instance. It is indeed a non-Arab nation. It has democratic system. It has non-Muslim population, but like most Muslim majority countries, Islam in Malaysia is the state religion, and it doesn't really embody the kind of ideological third worldist anti-colonial discourse that the Indonesian Republic has traditionally displayed. A bit of history. So before independence, even before the notion or even the name of Indonesia or Palestine itself is established and known, the relations between people living in the territory of what is known today in modern times as Indonesia and Palestine is apparent, and we can stretch back as far as the 15th century, particularly when we look at the establishment of a city in Indonesia called Kudus by a scholar born in Palestine, in Jerusalem. His name is Ja'far as-Sadiq, who came to Indonesia and played an instrumental role in spreading Islam in the archipelago. And he established this city in the island of Java called the city of Kudus. And if you go to this city, in the city center, you would actually find a very old mosque called the Kudus Mosque, or also known as Masjid Al-Aqsa. Masjid Al-Aqsa is, of course, the third holiest site of Islam, which is located in Palestine. And you do not find this elsewhere in other Muslim majority countries. Kudus, which is basically a localized version of the name Al-Quds, and Al-Quds is the other name of Jerusalem, right? So you don't have in Turkey or in Saudi Arabia a city that is confident enough to name itself Jerusalem of the local version of Jerusalem. It's only in Indonesia where we have that taking place. And yeah, this is on the left. It's carved inscription, basically indicating who created this mosque. And as I've said, we find out that it's actually Ja'far as-Sadiq, someone who came from Palestine, from Jerusalem, to spread Islam in Java and eventually the broader Indonesian archipelago. And if we go a bit closer to our times in the 20th century, we also see a close interactions between Indonesia mainly in their reactions against colonialism. So Palestine under British colonialism and Indonesia under Dutch colonialism. So you see how Indonesian Muslims, particularly Muslims, would know what happened that is taking place in Palestine, particularly to their Muslim brethren. In 1929, this incident called Palestine Riots, 1929 Palestine Riots, also known as the Buraq Uprising. And the Indonesian public actually reacted quite significantly to this occasion. We find evidence of Indonesians collecting money to be sent to the Palestinians in solidarity of their suffering. And we see that how collected an issue is being popularized, mainly rely on Islamic narratives at this stage. The picture on the left is a conference which invites scholars around the world in Jerusalem. It's organized in Jerusalem. It took place in 1931. And you could hear here in the middle a person who wears a cap like the one that I wear today. So he's also from Indonesia. His name is Abdullah, a very influential figure in Indonesia, would later become canonized as our national hero. So you could see here, even as early as 1930s, Indonesians interacting with Palestinians in Jerusalem mainly. Then the independence came in 1945 from Netherlands. The Indonesian Republic introduced its first constitution, which is still in effect until today. And you could see that the first preamble of the constitution says that independence is the inalienable right of all nations. Therefore, colonialism must be abolished in the world. Quite a strong statement and a very explicit.
Gilang, could I just, your bandwidth is low and from time to time you just break up for a few seconds.
Sorry? Also, it's a bit, the connection is not very good.
Every now and then. So as you mentioned, you had another network.
Okay, okay. Let me actually use that then. Yeah. Let me pause for a moment.
Sure, thanks.
Okay, how about now? Is it much better?
Yeah, it was only intermittent. So you carry on, and I'll let you know. But it should be better.
Okay, sure. Right. Okay. So again, the Indonesian constitution is explicitly against practices of colonialism, and the early founding fathers and the early senior politicians used this constitution to justify its support to colonized people around the world, including Palestine. And yeah, from the early on, they solely rely on this constitutional argument, and they deliberately avoid a religious one, especially, of course, Indonesia being a Muslim majority country, they avoid Islamic narrative in their official policy to support Palestine. This is a very interesting chart that I found in Pew Research Center, which kind of like tells you how unique Indonesian kind of like church and state relations, the ambiguous church and state relations as compared to other countries. So here it says that this basic chart that indicates countries that require head of state to come from particular religion. So you could see here, Andorra and Lebanon, the head of state has to be Christians. Bhutan and Thailand, they have to be Buddhist. And a lot of Muslim majority countries, they require the head of state to be Muslim. But you have this outlier here, only one category for only one country, Indonesia. It says here, Pancasila. So what on earth is this Pancasila? To be honest, I'm also surprised why Pancasila. Pancasila is not a religion, and yet this becomes a category in itself. But this tells how it's very important to really explain what this Pancasila means, especially to those to foreigners or those who are outside of Indonesian system. So what is Pancasila? Pancasila is basically, it means literally 5 principles. Panca means 5, sila means principles. These 5 principles are canonized as the Indonesian ideology. If you go to Indonesia, ask anyone basically, even like 10 years old, ask what is Pancasila, and I would bet that at least 90% of them would be able to mention one by one, precisely word by word, because it's kind of like this state mandated project to instill a degree of basically, as part of our civic studies, you have to learn national history and you have to learn national ideology, which is this Pancasila. It's pretty generic. It's basically, it says basically, you know, social justice, principles of humanity, and such, 5 principles. But number 1 here, it says, if you translated it in English, it says a belief in the Almighty God. So Indonesia, as I said, is not an Islamic state. It does not recognize Islam as the state religion. And so many foreign observers directly interpret this to say that Indonesia is a secular state because it does not recognize Islam as a state, as an official religion. But that's simply untrue, because even though Indonesia does not recognize Islam as the religion of the state, it recognized 6 religions at the same time to be the official religions of the state, namely Islam, Christianity, Protestantism. Oh, sorry. So Christianity is actually divided by 2 in our country: Protestantism and Catholicism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and traditional Chinese religion. For some reason, we call it Confucianism, but it's actually traditional Chinese religions. So in Indonesia, it's, you cannot publicly proselytize atheism, right? It's I don't know if it's illegal, but it's definitely very much frowned upon in the society. In our system, a good person is a religious person. You don't have to be Muslim, but you have to be religious, right? So it's basically, I think this is best encapsulated in a term coined by political scientist Jeremy Menchik, which is called godly nationalism. Indonesia's brand of nationalism being a godly nationalism, which basically says that for the country, belief in God is a cornerstone for the state ideology, but the state maintains ambiguity on which path to God its citizens should choose. So Indonesia in other words, applies a non-Islamic but pan-religious system in which the state acknowledges six official religions. Or in another word again, a system that is exclusively religious but not particular, right? So this will be very important for me to explain later on about the Muslim-Christian dynamics on how, because the Indonesian, even though the Indonesian government never says that Palestinian question is a religious issue, the overarching system really instills some an Indonesian person to be pious, and which later on would make this issue inevitably be saturated with religious narrative, especially between Muslims and Christians, even though, as we should um, easily understood, Israeli-Palestinian conflict is mainly a political one, not so much a religious one. Very quickly, so Indonesia, I think, largely speaking, its history could be broadly separated into two. The phase before the democratization process, that is before 1998, and after the democratization process, after 1998 until the present. Before the democratization process, we have two presidents, Insinyur Soekarno, Soekarno, who is most famous for his contribution in basically third world movement and in establishing the first Asian African conference in Bandung. He is most popularly known for being staunchly anti-colonial, and for the same reason, he is known for being very pro-Palestinian. Under General Suharto, he also maintains the same commitment to Palestinian solidarity, but because unlike Suharto is more pro-US, so you start to see the decline of third worldist narrative, because one of the important backbone of third worldism is non-alignment, right? And that is the policy under Sukarno, but under Suharto, that is pretty much in decline because he aligned himself more towards the Western camp led by the US, and the system is basically a military dictatorship. Now, there are one pattern that is common between two presidents, which is an explicit aversion to Islamic discourse in foreign policy. So be it Sukarno, be it Suharto, they always say that Palestinian question is, again, a commitment against colonialism, and there is explicit aversion to Islamic discourse in foreign policy. Even though we know deep down inside in the hearts of many Indonesians, most of them are Muslims, it is also, of course, a religious issue. As I've established before independence, it's pretty much exclusively religious. It's pretty much your connection to Al-Aqsa and Islamic solidarity, but under this undemocratic regime, this narrative is basically being repressed. So what happened when finally the country experienced democratization? These previously repressed religious narratives basically become like a session where a Pandora box is being opened, basically. These groups starts to express their religiosity more publicly, because the kind of restrictions that we saw under the dictatorship was not already there again. And yeah, in effect, previously, whereas we see that Indonesia's pro-Palestinian position is a national consensus, whereas you are a Muslim, whereas whether you are Christian or Buddhist, you are Indonesians and you are under the same constitution, right? And then the president will always say our constitution is explicitly against colonialism, that's why we must support Palestine. So under that constitutional argument, you could have this overarching national consensus to support Palestine. But after democratization, when, as I've explained, more religious narratives is being displayed in the public, then you start to see some discord from the previously or traditionally held consensus to support Palestine. And this was pretty much what I would discuss later on with the pro-Israeli, the upsurge of pro-Israeli voice, mainly from the Christian communities in Indonesia. Okay, now let's start first with the Muslims. Yeah, what are the kind of pro-Palestinian expressions in contemporary Muslims in Indonesia? First of all, popular culture. It's pretty much obvious. If you go to Jakarta, you go to big cities, you would easily find Palestinian flags everywhere, mainly in Muslim religious circles. They would even incorporated it in different products. This is called sarung. I have several sarungs on my wardrobe. This is usually something that we wear to pray, for Muslims to pray. And you could see the Palestinian flags being incorporated to the sarung. You will also see the kind of like, let's say, hybridization between the Palestinian keffiyeh, the Palestinian shawl, and the local Indonesian pattern called batik. So this is the local Indonesian pattern. As you could see, it's different than the original Palestinian pattern. And you could see on one side, you have the Palestinian flag. On the other, you have the Indonesian flag. You also have novels, many novels in which Palestine become a central theme. Dietary products, such as dates. And this is, I could translate in Indonesian, humanitarian concert, yeah, konser kemanusiaan, or humanitarian concert for Palestine. So Palestine is also a very recurrent theme in popular songs, especially those made by Muslim groups. This is perhaps a fascinating milestone by Indonesian Muslim groups who partake in a popular fundraising to establish the second biggest hospital in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip. It's called Rumah Sakit Indonesia, or the Indonesian Hospital. It's the second biggest in the region. And yeah, this is very an important milestone, because previously any aid that is being transferred to Indonesia is mainly from the government. But this is the first time everything 100% is fundraised by the population, and mainly those who are affiliated to Muslim groups and Muslim humanitarian groups. And also an interesting part about the hospital is that many of the rooms would actually be named using some local aspects from Indonesia. So for instance, this is named with Tengku Cikditiro, which is a local hero from the region of Aceh. There will also be a room called the Java room, or the Celebes room, the Borneo room. So it kind of like tries to make this very strong bond between the two nations from this kind of like concrete, tangible aspect. Another interesting thing is, I think in the past 3 years or so, a tradition of celebrating Indonesian independence in Gaza. And this is mostly organized by Muslim groups again. And we do not see the same thing happening, for instance, celebrating Malaysian independence or Turkish independence. It is, for some reason, only Indonesia. And of course, for the audience at home, for Indonesian Muslims, this kind of like shows that, well, they have treated us specially. So we also, Indonesians, have to treat Palestinians with equal esteem and with equal level of special treatment, basically. This has become so much so, right? As I said, the kind of increase of affinity to Palestinians among Indonesian Muslims have come to a point so much so that this becomes what I called in my thesis a marker of their piety, right? So this has transformed into, so Palestine has become like a synonym to anything that is religiously good from an Islamic perspective. This, of course, an overgeneralization, but we could sense this sentiment. So for instance, in Indonesia, we find several newly built mosques in the past 10 or 20 years or so that is named Al-Aqsa, right? Such as this very big and beautiful mosque in the city of Klaten. It's called the Mosque of Al-Aqsa. And I went to the Ministry of Religion to know how many are there, and it's actually 70. It's quite a lot. Another example is the popularity of what is called the Gazan method for Quran memorization. So for Muslims, it's actually a common thing, and it's not very rare for the adherents of Islam to try to memorize Quran. So for instance, I attended like a religious boarding school, and I have to at least, so it has the Quran has 30 juz. Juz is basically parts. I have to memorize at least 3 parts to graduate. But some Muslims actually memorize all of the parts, like the entirety from page 1 until the end of the Quran. And of course, it is not easy to memorize the entire text. And so some people want to learn a more effective method on how to memorize the Quran. And in recent years, I start to see how this so-called Gazan method is being popularized in Indonesia. Even though when I asked several pro-Palestinian activists that I interviewed, objectively speaking, there should be, there potentially be, we could make a case that there are better methods, such as that is developed in Mauritania or Sudan. But again, because in Palestine has become such marker of Muslim piety, this method is becoming more popular than the one from, let's say, Sudan or Mauritania, which one could argue is actually more effective for some circles that I interview in memorizing the Quran. This goes to an extent where when I do my critical media research in social media and YouTube videos, for instance, a process in which Palestinians are being essentialized as a pious nation, right? So you would often find religious preachers saying, "Hey, Indonesians, why are you so lenient with religion? Why are you so focused on worldly affairs? You should look to Palestinians because these people are very pious. These people memorize Quran. These people such and such." Yeah, Palestine has somewhat become a role model for anything that is pious to several Muslim groups that I observe in Indonesia. And one last point to emphasize this observation is a narrative that kind of like portrays the Palestinian question and imbues it with such theological and eschatological importance that the support of Indonesians, especially Muslims, to Palestine is directly connected to the rewards and punishment in the hereafter. So basically, it is almost like a kind of pressure, a kind of expectation that Muslims have to support Palestine because, as this is, I'm directly quoting this sentence that I found in a donation website. So before I click the donate, is basically to click to donate the money. There is this sentence. It says that basically says that you have to donate for Palestine because in the hereafter, God will ask you, what have you done for the sake of Palestine? So if you haven't done anything, if you haven't donated your money, then you don't have a good answer when God asks this question. So faced with this narrative and sentiments, neutrality to the Palestinian question for many Indonesian Muslims is not an option. It's like, it's a must. Because even though you don't, in your daily life, you don't really care, but you know that you will die, right? And when you die, you will be resurrected. And when you are resurrected, God will ask you things. And one of the things that God asks is, what will you do for Palestine? Because Palestine is, especially Al-Aqsa, right? It's such of theological, and by eschatological, I mean that Palestine and the surrounding regions, which is Greater Syria, is prophesied to be basically an important theater of several battles, right? I think same as well in the Christian and Jewish tradition. This region is basically an important theater in several eschatological events. So this is among the reasons. So when Palestine has become a marker of piety, it can also be, quote unquote, a commodity for those who are labeled impious, right? This is what I call neutralizing anti-Islam allegations by using Palestinian symbols. So for instance, you have here the son of the current Indonesian president, who is, this is a picture in 2020. At that time, he was attempting to become the mayor of the city of Solo in Java. And he's basically trying to gain as much support as possible. Now, he came from this particular party in Indonesia, currently the biggest party, it's called PDI Perjuangan, which is often spoken of in the public discourse as being anti-Islam. So this is, of course, a political liability for him because Indonesia is a Muslim majority country. So by wearing a Palestinian shawl, it's somewhat kind of like neutralize these anti-Islam allegations, because it's basically you are giving a cue to your audience that I'm unlike the popular assumption of my party as being anti-Islam because, hey, I support Palestine, right? So this is what the direct implication of the perception of Palestine as being a marker of Muslim piety. Lastly, for the Muslims, is this perception that I found. This is not very commonplace, but I do find it in some circles. The perception that Indonesia would become the prophesized Muslim liberator of Palestine. So basically, in the Islamic tradition, there is this belief, right? There is this belief that there are certain chosen people that God would bestow the task to restore Islamic glory. And some narrations, I'm not really sure the degree of authenticity in traditional, of course, this is the realm of the traditional Islamic circles of the seminaries. But some narration says that these people would come from the east, from the east, not really from the Arab world, but from the east. But it, of course, it doesn't really tell which nation or which part of the east. But this particular narration is being used by some Indonesian Muslims to endow themselves an idea of self-importance, that we are the people who would liberate Palestine in the hereafter as prophesied in this and that narrative. And so in this very viral video, there is this one popular Islamic preacher, his name is Rahmat Baikuni, who basically shares what he heard from some Palestinians, like a kind of a dream, right? A kind of a dream, like a prophesied dream, where it says, well, I really questioned the authenticity, but it says that several Palestinian people have the same dream, that for some reason a help from God in the form of Indonesian people would come to Palestine and liberate the land from Israeli oppression. And another iteration of this idea is being conveyed by another preacher called Abdul Samad, Ustad Abdul Samad, rahimahullah. He gave basically in 2019 a public sermon. He made this very interesting kind of like analogy. He says that God gives different Muslim nations a task and period to liberate the Holy Land, right? So at one point, it was Caliph Umar who basically conquered Jerusalem from the hand of, I think it was the Christian Byzantines, right? And then the crusade happened. Then the city was, quote unquote, liberated once again by Salahuddin or Saladin. And he is actually of Kurdish origin. So he represented the Kurdish people. Then you have another important history, which is the conquer of Constantinople by Sultan Mehmed II, who represent, so to speak, the Turkish people. So he basically said, the Arabs already have their role. The Kurds already have their role as well. And so too the Turks. And so the next people who would get the role is us. He says the Malay people, but Malay is basically a more general term that comprise Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei. So even though, of course, I don't think he makes this to be something that is scripturally or canonically authoritative, but the kind of rhetoric that is being used kind of like shows you how the Indonesians themselves also think, some Indonesian Muslims, that we must support Palestine because we are the destined people that God kind of like would want us to be the one who liberate Palestine. Now, finally, interestingly, this is not a one-sided aspiration. Some Palestinian scholars actually affirm this conviction. One person that I found is Dr. Abu Bakr al-Awawida, who basically affirmed this aspiration that, yes, indeed, the prophecy says that the liberator of Palestine will come from the east. And he said that he hoped Indonesia would be the prophesied nation that would lead that Muslim liberation of Palestine. I wasn't able to find the original Arabic statement. I found it only from secondary sources. So I also questioned the authenticity of this quote. But suffice it to say that this questionable quote from this Palestinian scholar has become popularized. If you go to several social media pages, this is being used to give a fuel to Indonesian Muslims to support more Palestine at times where sometimes the kind of solidarity does experience some ebb and flows. Now, what about the Christians? On this Christian side, going a bit historical, you do find before contemporary times some signs of aspiration to reach Israel, right? On the left, I found this is from the Israeli State Archive, a letter from R.S. Sumokil. He is the self-appointed president of the South Moluccan Republic. It's basically a separatist movement, a Christian separatist movement that want to separate from the Indonesian Republic to establish its own Christian republic in the Moluccan Islands. So he sent this letter to the Israeli Prime Minister asking for help, but the help didn't come, so it didn't materialize. But suffice it to say, we know that there are some efforts for outreach. And the one on the right is, I found some compilations of letters from, this is, you could read here, Kupang, which is a city in East Nusa Tenggara, which is known for being a Christian majority province. So several letters basically asking the foreign ministry to give them materials about Israel because they want to know, quote unquote, the truth about Israel. And pretty much religious narratives is very strong in the letters. They want to know Israel because, as you could read here, it is the Holy Land. We want to know Israel as the chosen people and such and such. And for today, we still see this. So it's not only historical, but we see this in contemporary times. Philo-Semitic and pro-Israeli expressions in Christian majority province. If you go, Pak Ferry, are you from Northern Sulawesi? You're from Northern Sulawesi, right?
Yeah.
So I would imagine this, the picture on the left would be very familiar to you. This
Yes.
is, so to speak, I don't know if it's the biggest in the world, but it's definitely the biggest in Asia, a menorah statue in the province of North Sulawesi. It's so big, located on top of a hill, so it's, you cannot miss the statue if you go to that region. And yeah, this province is a Christian majority province, and it hosts the only currently functioning synagogue in Indonesia. In the middle, this is parade that is regularly organized in the province of Papua, which is also a Christian majority. And on the right, this picture I got from students from the province of East Nusa Tenggara, Catholic majority province. I think it's the only province that regularly send its students to learn about agriculture in Israel. Several politicians have also, Christian politicians have also been associated by the public. Of course, this has, sometimes it's a bit exaggerated, but it's fair to say that there are some points of truth that Christian figures in Indonesia, such as Beni Murdani, or the one who lives today is Luhut Panjaitan, who is currently the coordinating minister of maritime affairs. He played quite a substantial role in trying to strengthen relations with Israel. In 2001, traditionally, we do not have trade relations with Israel, but in 2001, he revoked the trade ban when he was the Minister of Trade. In 2020, he played an instrumental role in facilitating talks with the US to get some aids, which there is some string attached. The US said, you will get this aid if Indonesia normalize its relations with Israel, but this does not materialize because, of course, this is a very unpopular policy, which I would imagine Minister Luhut would not want to risk. And this year, based on my interviews, I find out that the one university in North Sumatra called Del Institute of Technology, which is established by this Christian minister, regularly also send students to be trained, especially in technology and agriculture in Israel. It's important to understand Christian Zionism as a transnational phenomenon, and Indonesia is not an exception. Strong expressions of philo-Semitism and pro-Israeli position in Indonesia, according to my research, can be traced back to the penetration of US-based Christian denominations and literature in Indonesia, particularly from the 70s and 80s onward. This also has a direct correlation with the so-called charismatic turn in global Christianity, the rise of Pentecostal and charismatic movements worldwide. And according to some literatures that I consult, there is indeed an observable trend of, to quote Williams in his 2015 article, a Pentecostalization of Christian Zionism. And I would like to hear more actually from the audience about your observation of this trend, but this is what, at least at the surface, I also do notice from my interviewees. Those who come from the Pentecostal and charismatic background tend to have more stronger pro-Israeli and pro-philo-Semitic views, basically. But we also have to consider the increase of Indonesian Christians' visits to Israel in recent years, so much so that Indonesian tourists is named actually by the Israeli Ministry of Tourism as the biggest daily spender of tourist sector in Israel, more than Americans, more than Chinese, more than Koreans. So they spend an average $310 per day, excluding the fare cost. The flight cost. Number 4, and this is something that in the discussion session I would actually want to hear more from Mr. Ferry, is kind of like a contrast between the newer mega churches and denominations in Indonesia against the more older Christian organizations such as PGI, or the Communion of Churches in Indonesia, which tend to follow the Indonesian government's pro-Palestine policy. So I do observe that some older Christian organizations that tend to be more economical, the Baptists, the Calvinists, the Catholics, tend to follow Indonesia's government's pro-Palestine policy, whereas the newer churches, the newer denominations, particularly those from the Pentecostal and charismatic groups, tend to be more pro-Israeli. But this is also open for discussion. Now, how do we converge this information coherently, hopefully? Pretty much this. This is how I understand. So we do observe that separately, Muslim Indonesians do have a very strong attachment to Palestine by virtue of, well, first of all, Al-Aqsa being the third holiest mosque in Islam, and Palestine being a Muslim majority nation as well. So, and even before independence, as I've already established, the connection is very strong. And the Christians, Indonesians as well, towards Israel, there are some affinities to Israel, mainly when Israel is understood as in its biblical iteration as being the Holy Land, then there are, of course, some affinity to Israel, even though, of course, the modern state is different from the one that is in the Bible, but still, we do observe that the discourse taking place. Now, this all somewhat experience an interesting turn after the democratization process after 1998. When, again, previously, it's pretty much the nation, it has a pro-Palestinian national consensus, right? So even though the Christians, they do reach out to Israel, but in general, they never made their pro-Israeli voice public. At least they still, if not they care for the Palestinians, they are apathetic. So it's just like a don't care attitude. But after 1998, with the rise of religionization of society and identity politics, then you have also globalization and transnational movements, kind of like making the situation more complex. You have a resurgence of Islam in public discourse. And this contributes, as I've also established, even Palestine becoming a marker of piety for Indonesian Muslims. And this also, I would explain later on, kind of like make a Palestine first sentiments, Palestine being the issue that we have to care as compared to, let's say, the one in Uyghur, in Kashmir, in Yemen, right? So Palestine becomes this archetypical Muslim issue for Muslims. And this doesn't go well with a lot of Indonesian Christians. So there are some counter reactions from Indonesian Christians, mainly like, why do you prioritize Palestine than our situation as a minority, which also experience certain degrees of oppression. And this, when you already observe that the national consensus of pro-Palestinians already experience certain degree of discord, because the Muslim majority groups no longer kind of like becoming committed to the national consensus that is constitution, and more becoming attached to the more Islamic discourse, then the Christians also then start to kind of like diverge away from the national consensus, which is to support Palestine according to the constitution, and start to adopt more pro-Israeli views. Now let's talk about what I meant by Palestine first sentiments. This is from two interviewees. Yeah, basically they said, yeah, why Indonesian Muslims care about Palestine when there is more urgent crisis in Yemen, right, where popular donation campaigns were much rather heard? Or why don't we care more about the fate of Rohingya in Myanmar? Because Myanmar is in Southeast Asia, it's closer to us. Why don't we care more about the Rohingyas, but we talk more about Palestine, right? This form of counter reactions are becoming more expressed, I think, especially in social media. Another example is a counter reaction to what we typically call a mosque marathon by Palestinian religious scholars. So before the pandemic, it is like an annual tradition every month, the holy month of Ramadan, that Palestinian scholars will come to Indonesia and go from one mosque to another to introduce about Palestine and eventually to raise funds to Palestine. Now, I interview one activist who accompanied one of these sheikh or one of this religious scholar, and he tell quite a interesting story when the sheikh visited a mosque in North Sumatra. When he has finished his sermons, there is like a Q&A session, and one of the person from the congregation asked, why should I donate to Palestine and not help the victims of a recent domestic disaster? So it was 2018 at the time, and there was an earthquake in the island of Sulawesi. So he basically asked, yeah, why should I care to Palestine? Why not something that happened nearby? Person of the same nationality who I should have more responsibility towards. And yeah, my interviewee said that the Palestinian sheikh could not provide a satisfactory answer, which yeah, it doesn't really go well with the person who asked the question. And of course, as I've said, when Indonesia start to essentialize Palestinians as an inherently pious nation, with high hopes comes also high expectations and higher potential of disappointment. So when Palestinian scholars come to Indonesia, there is always almost the case that they are styled as sheikh. Yeah. So as you could see here, it's always a talk show by a Palestinian sheikh, even though sheikh is actually something that should not be given easily. It is a title that is given for people who have undergone a long duration of religious learning, and typically who is typically very senior in age. But for some reason, just because they come from Palestine, this sheikh title, this very important title, is being easily given to. And so my interviewee shared some stories of disappointment because the Indonesian audience, Muslim audience, expect the Palestinians to be able to answer complex religious questions. Well, after all, they said that they are sheikh, but in reality, some of them, of course, not all, most of them are actually actual sheikh. They live up to their credentials, but some cases, unfortunately, we find where there are Indonesian Muslims are disappointed because they don't live up to the sheikh credentials. This counter reaction, interestingly, comes also from the Palestinian politicians themselves. When Palestine is becoming so an object of such degree of fascination, its symbols paraded everywhere regardless of context, right? Whether it's domestic protests, whether it's cultural events, Palestine flags is everywhere. the Palestinian embassy actually protests such usage, right? In 2017, in January, it produced a letter saying that we regret that our symbol, the Palestinian flag, had been raised during, it says, a non-peaceful rallies connected with pure Indonesian domestic affairs, right? So that, according to the embassy, cannot be considered by any means a sign of support. So this is very rare, right? For Palestine embassy around the world, they would actually love if their flags are being paraded because it shows that their country is popular. But here in Indonesia, the Palestinian embassy actually issued this protest. Why? Because there are indeed, this timing is very telling. This announcement was made in 2017, and in January, several months after a particular protest that is established by an anti-government groups and anti-government parties. And yeah, it's basically a purely domestic affairs, and the Palestinian flag is being raised there. And of course, this does not goes well with the Palestinian embassy because the protest is actually against the government. And the Palestinian embassy wants to have a good relation with the government because after all, their host is the government. If the government, Indonesian government doesn't like Palestine, then they have full power to actually expel the Palestinian embassy, ambassador, if they want to. And coming to the Christian reaction, these Palestinian flags also triggers a sense of unease to a lot of Christians, because in some of the protests, these Palestinian flags are being raised in a protest that is meant and target a particular person who is named Basuki Cahaya Purnama. So he is the first Christian governor of the province of Jakarta, and he was sentenced to imprisonment out of allegations for blaspheming the Holy Quran. And in this protest against this Christian governor, the Indonesian flag, the Palestinian flags are being widely paraded. So to a lot of Christians, even though maybe they are pro-Palestinian, but knowing that the groups that use the flags are those who are perceived to be against Christians, then they find it a degree of unease when they see Palestinian flags. I think I have to skip this. This as well. Okay, so this is the last point that I would like to make for this part, is that for some Christians, because the Palestinian question has now becoming so much kind of like Islamicized, for some of them to be able to relate again to the question, to the Palestinian question, and to be able to relate again in the support, in the national support of Palestine, then they try to kind of like convince the public that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not a religious cause, that it is actually a national issue and not about religion, right? So some of the groups, especially the older ones, such as PGI, the National Communion of Indonesian Churches, is actively doing that endeavor. But on the other hand, some Christian groups, especially the Christian Zionist group that I interviewed, actually said we have to use religion to view the conflict. According to one interviewee who is the founder of Christian Zionist organization. And I asked why you have to rely on religion to be able to see the issue. And then she said, because if we understand, because this is a Christian Zionist movement, and which is very, very pro-Israeli, if they portray their support as being a political support to Israel, then that would be seen by the government as a sign of political dissent, a sign of a protest to a long-standing political position. But when you understand and when you sow support from Christians toward Israel from a religious perspective, then it's actually more tolerable from the government perspective, because after all, Christianity is a recognized religion in Indonesia, right? So the Indonesian government could not shut down Christian sermons. They could not shut down Christian teachings. So they have to use Christian narratives to sow support towards Israel, because if they use purely political arguments such as, yeah, we just don't, we have to normalize relations with Israel because politically speaking, it is more beneficial than such. It's for them, it's a bit, it's going to cause more hardship because of the potential repercussions from the Indonesian government. I think I have to stop there. Just some takeaways, I think, from this webinar is how interlinked, right, this, at least three aspects that we could understand by looking only from the Indonesian engagement with the Palestinian question. We could see at least three perspectives. First is the dynamics between Muslims and Christians on one hand. We could also understand the dynamic between church and state separation in Indonesia, right? If only Indonesia is unambiguous regarding its church and state dynamics. For instance, if Indonesia simply say that Islam is the religion, the official religion of the state, then we won't have this kind of like debates, because the government and the people would just very easily use religious narratives to justify its support. But in Indonesia, it's very ambiguous, so that's why we do see pro-Israeli voices much more so than a typical Muslim majority countries. And on the other hand, this also shows the third point that I would like to, that I think we also touch upon quite extensively, the blurriness of foreign and domestic affairs. How when Israel-Palestine is being talked about in Indonesia, sometimes it's not so much about what's going out there in like as a foreign issue, how to resolve this foreign conflict going out there, but it also reflects kind of like domestic cleavages and markers of belonging, really, between communities inside Indonesia, especially those who are religious. And to close, before the question and discussion session, I found these two quotes from amazing academics Atalia Omer and Helga Tawil Suri, very impactful and pretty much encapsulate what I would like to convey through this seminar, that Palestine and Israel today have readily become moral destinations and normative symbolic topographies for diverse groups, which become an aspirational utopia, literally a no place outside ordinary historical time and place. While this can be a good thing, because diverse people would be able to relate to the question and would be, and for particularly from the Palestinian perspective, this would also mean that diverse groups will be able to relate to their suffering and relate to their struggle. At the same time, there is a flip side to the coin, as conveyed by Helga Tawil Suri. In being framed as a universal cause, do the demands of Palestinians become secondary, right? Whether embraced in a fight for democracy or incorporated into global jihad, Palestinians may become bystanders to their own cause. So it might not always be the case, but surely it is an interesting observation that we could do, how perhaps for those people who actually care about Palestine, by actually treating it as a symbol more than a material reality of a struggle for self-determination and against oppression, it might actually make the demands of the Palestinians secondary. So I think that's all from me. Really sorry if I stretch a bit in terms of time, but I would really love to hear question and feedbacks from the audience. Thank you very much.